Before we dive into these scary stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy true horror content every week. It was a chilly November evening when I got home from work, and the last thing I expected was to find my front door slightly open. I froze at the sight. Confusion was washing over me. Had I forgotten to lock it? I never left my door unlocked. Heart beating, I pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out, "Hello?" Silence. The house felt cold and empty. I hesitated, scanning the living room for any signs of a break-in. Everything seemed in order, but the unsettling feeling in my gut didn't ease. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. I walked further into the house, checking the back door and the windows. Still locked. Everything was as I had left it that morning. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light or my own imagination and decided to settle in for the night. I grabbed a snack and flopped down on the couch, turning on the TV. As I relaxed, a soft creaking sound came from the hallway. My heart dropped. I turned down the volume, straining to listen. There it was again, unmistakable. Someone was moving around in the house. I scrambled for my phone, ready to call for help, but the thought of drawing attention to myself made me freeze. I needed to be quiet and assess the situation. I slipped out of the living room and quietly crept toward the hallway. The sound grew louder, and I could see the dim outline of a figure near the bathroom door. Panic surged through me and I slowly backed away, but a floorboard creaked beneath my feet. The figure turned, and in the shadows I could make out the silhouette of a man. "What do you want?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped into the light, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "Just looking for a place to stay," he said casually, as if we were having a normal conversation. "Get out of my house!" I shouted, adrenaline pumping through me. He chuckled softly. "You're not in a position to give orders, sweetheart." I turned and sprinted for the kitchen, desperate to put some distance between us. I grabbed a knife from the block and held it tightly as I searched for a way out. The back door was my best chance. I could hear his footsteps echoing behind me as I dashed toward it. Just as I reached the door, I felt a hand grasp my shoulder. I swung the knife, but he was too quick. He grabbed my wrist and twisted it, forcing the blade to clatter to the floor. "Let's not make this messy," he said, tightening his grip. Fear surged through me, and I kicked backward, catching him off guard. He stumbled back, and I seized the opportunity, darting toward the door. I flung it open and bolted outside, adrenaline fueling my escape. I sprinted to the neighbor's house and pounded on the door, shouting for help. My neighbor opened the door, alarmed. "What's going on?" "Call the cops. There's someone in my house." As my neighbor reached for his phone, I glanced back toward my own house. I could see the figure standing in the doorway, watching me. The police arrived within minutes, and I could feel the weight of their presence as they swept through the house. I waited anxiously on the porch, praying they'd find him. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers approached me. "We didn't find anyone inside," he said. "Are you sure you saw someone?" "I know what I saw. He was in the house," I protested, desperation creeping into my voice. The officer frowned, but nodded. "We'll keep an eye out in the area. Lock your doors and call us if you notice anything else." I returned home, shaken but determined to keep my wits about me. I checked all the locks, peering out the window, searching for any sign of the man. But all was quiet. Days passed and I tried to move on, but the fear lingered. I kept my doors locked, my phone close. One evening I decided to relax with a movie, trying to forget the unease that had taken hold of me. As the film played, a soft knock echoed from the back door. My heart dropped. I turned off the TV and held my breath, listening intently. The knocking continued, insistent. I glanced at the clock. It was after midnight. I tiptoed to the back door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me, and I reached for my phone to call the police again. but when they came, they found no one. I decided I had to move shortly after, as I no longer felt safe in my own home. Since I was a kid, I've always been a deep sleeper. I could fall asleep in the middle of a thunderstorm or with a TV blaring in the background, no problem. But that all changed after my stay at the Briarwood Inn. I haven't had a good night's sleep since, and every time I close my eyes, I feel like I'm back in that cursed room. The Briarwood Inn was one of those charmingly old-fashioned hotels people rave about. I was on a road trip for work and needed a place to crash for the night, and Briarwood popped up with decent reviews. It was out of the way, quiet, and had that quaint, historic vibe. Perfect, I thought. The receptionist, an older man in a slightly rumpled uniform, handed me my key with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Room 312, he said. "Thanks," I said, hoisting my bag onto my shoulder. As I headed toward the elevator, he called out, "Oh, and if you need anything at all, call the front desk, no matter the time." It was a strange thing to say, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The room itself was nothing special. It had the same slightly worn carpet and overly floral bedding you'd expect from an older hotel. By 11 p.m., I was out cold. I woke up suddenly sometime in the early hours of the morning. It wasn't the kind of waking where you stretch and groggily roll over. It was sharp, immediate, like my body was on high alert. My eyes snapped open, and that's when I realized I couldn't move. I've had sleep paralysis before. It's terrifying but fleeting, and usually no more than a few seconds of feeling trapped in your own body. But this time was different. The room was dead silent, yet I could hear faint whispers too low to make out. My eyes darted around the room, trying to find the source of the noise. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then I noticed the shadows in the corner by the window. They were moving. Not like the flicker of tree branches or headlights passing by outside. These shadows moved with intention. My heart pounded in my chest, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't even scream. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they weren't coming from the corner. They were coming from all around me. Words in a language I couldn't understand. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest. It was tall and thin, with limbs unnaturally long. Its face, or where its face should have been, was blank and featureless. It moved closer. The figure bent down until it was level with me. Its featureless face was inches from mine. I couldn't breathe. My chest burned from the effort of trying to move, to scream, to do anything. Then it whispered, directly into my ear. "I see you." The next thing I knew, it was morning. I woke up drenched in sweat, with my heart racing like I'd just run a marathon. The room was bright, the shadows gone, and there was no sign of the figure. I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare, a horrifyingly vivid one, but just a dream nonetheless. That hope vanished when I noticed the bruises on my wrists, as though someone, or something, had been holding me down. I packed up and left without showering or even brushing my teeth. I just wanted to get out of there. When I handed the key back to the receptionist, he gave me a knowing look. "Sleep okay?" I hesitated. "Do you get a lot of complaints about room 312? He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You're not the first, if that's what you're asking. Then why rent it out?" He looked genuinely apologetic. "The owner won't close it, says it's bad for business. But, if you don't mind me asking, what did you see?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Even now, just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. That night, after driving several hours and checking into a completely different hotel, I tried to sleep again. It happened almost immediately. As soon as I closed my eyes, I felt that same paralysis wash over me. I opened my eyes, and this time, I wasn't in the new hotel room. I was back in room 312, lying on that same bed with the same whispers surrounding me. And in the corner, the shadows began to move again. It's been months since my stay at the Briarwood Inn, and I haven't had a full night's sleep since. Every time I try, I end up back in that room, trapped in that same waking nightmare. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, room 312 always finds me, and no one believes me. I'm about to go insane. It started out as a completely normal road trip. I'd been planning it for months, a solo drive up the coast to clear my head and get away from the monotony of daily life. I loaded my car with snacks, a cooler of drinks, and a carefully curated playlist for the hours ahead. It was supposed to be peaceful, even boring. It wasn't. The first time I noticed the beat-up old sedan, I was halfway through the first day of the trip. It pulled into the same gas station as me, a little worse for wear, with chipped paint and a deep dent on the passenger side door. I wouldn't have paid much attention to it if it hadn't been for the driver. He was a wiry man with hollow cheeks and sharp eyes that seemed to dart around like he was expecting something, or someone. He wore a ratty baseball cap pulled low over his face. He pumped gas into his car while looking over his shoulder repeatedly. I didn't think much of it. Lots of people are paranoid. Maybe he'd had a rough morning, or maybe he was just naturally jumpy. I finished fueling my car, grabbed a soda, and got back on the road. But a couple of hours later, I noticed the sedan again. I was on a lonely stretch of highway with nothing around but endless fields and the occasional billboard. It was the kind of road where you could go 20 minutes without seeing another car. And yet, when I glanced in my rearview mirror, there it was, the same dented sedan a few car lengths back. I shrugged it off. Coincidences happen. But it stayed with me. Every turn I made, every rest stop I pulled into, that car seemed to show up within minutes. The third time it happened, I started to feel uneasy. By sunset, I'd convinced myself that I was imagining things. Maybe it wasn't the same car. Lots of sedans look alike, and it wasn't like I was being chased or anything. Still, I decided to stay the night in a small roadside motel rather than push forward. The parking lot was nearly empty when I pulled in, but a few minutes later, as I checked in at the front desk, the sedan rolled in too. My stomach sank. I watched through the window as the man got out of the car and leaned casually against it, lighting a cigarette. He didn't seem to notice me, or if he did, he didn't show it. But something about his presence sent chills down my spine. That night I couldn't sleep. My room faced the parking lot, and every so often I'd peek out the window to check on the sedan. The man was gone, but the car was still there. At some point, my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, slipped on my sneakers, and quietly stepped outside. The night air was cool, and the lot was silent. The sedan looked even worse up close. The dent I'd noticed earlier was deeper than I'd thought, and there were long scratches along the trunk like someone had taken a crowbar to it. The back of the car smelled faintly metallic, like rust, or something worse. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then leaned in closer to the trunk. There was dried mud caked around the edges and what looked like a smear of blood. But surely that couldn't be. I stepped back quickly. I didn't know what I'd expected to find, but suddenly, I didn't want to know. I hurried back to my room and locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, the sedan was gone. I told myself it was over, that I'd probably just let my imagination get carried away. But as I merged back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong. That's when the radio interrupted my thoughts. Police are still searching for Matthew Curtis, who is wanted in connection with multiple homicides across the state. Curtis is believed to be driving a dark sedan, last seen heading north on Highway 17. Authorities are urging anyone with information to come forward. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and quickly searched for news about the man. His mugshot came up immediately. Those same hollow cheeks, those darting eyes. It was him. It was the man from the gas station, from the motel, from the dented sedan. I felt sick. Suddenly everything clicked. The blood on the trunk, his paranoid glances, the way he'd seemed to follow me. I hadn't imagined it. He really had been following me. and now I had a horrible suspicion about why. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I'd seen the car and the man? That I'd noticed blood on the trunk but hadn't done anything about it? They already knew what he looked like, what he was driving. I didn't have anything new to add. Still, I couldn't shake the thought. What had been in that trunk? I drove the rest of the trip in a haze, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the sedan appear behind me again. It never did, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was there a body in his trunk? To this day, I'll never know for sure, but deep down, I think I already do. A few summers ago, my girlfriend Emily and I decided to go on a trip to celebrate our 3-year anniversary. We chose a remote beachside resort on an island that promised private villas, stunning ocean views, and an escape from the crowds. I still remember how excited we were on the ferry ride over, talking about the snorkeling we'd do, the meals we'd try, and how it would be a vacation we'd never forget. The resort was exactly as advertised: beautiful, isolated, and incredibly peaceful. Our villa was set right along the shoreline, with a wooden deck that opened directly onto a pristine, sandy beach. You could hear the waves lapping gently against the shore from any room in the villa. It felt like paradise. The first night we went down to the beach after dinner to stargaze. It was pitch dark except for the moon, which casted a silver glow over the water. There was no one else on the beach, and all we could hear was the soft crashing of waves. As we lay there in the sand, Emily pointed to something in the water, maybe 50 or 60 yards out. At first, I thought it was a piece of driftwood just floating along the surface, but then it bobbed up and down in a way that didn't look quite right. "Is that a person?" Emily whispered, clutching my arm. I squinted, straining to see. It almost looked like someone was out there, just a head floating above the water, staring back at us. But it was too far out to make out any details, just a shape. I tried to reassure Emily, telling her it was probably just debris or a trick of the moonlight, but deep down I felt uneasy. That head wasn't moving with the current. It was perfectly still, too still for a swimmer, too round for a rock. "Come on, let's go back," I suggested, brushing it off as nothing. Emily's face told me she was spooked. The next morning, we asked a staff member if it was safe to swim out near that spot. He just laughed and assured us that the water was calm and safe, with no dangerous wildlife. Emily and I spent the day at the beach, and although we didn't see anything unusual, I couldn't shake the memory of that thing we'd seen the night before. Every so often, I'd find myself glancing out at the water, half expecting to see that head again. Later that day, we decided to snorkel. The water was crystal clear, and you could see almost to the bottom. But as we swam out farther from the shore, I began to feel disoriented. The water beneath us suddenly looked much darker, even though the sun was still shining. I looked over at Emily, and she seemed fine, happily swimming along, oblivious. Then, just as I was about to tell her we should head back, I saw something down below. It was faint at first, almost like a shadow, moving slowly along the ocean floor. I tried to focus, but every time I thought I saw it clearly, it shifted, blurring into the water. It wasn't a fish or a person. It was more like a ripple in the ocean itself, something moving with the water but not part of it. My heart raced as the shadow drifted closer, rising slowly toward the surface, toward us. Emily noticed my panic and swam over, grabbing my arm. "What's wrong?" she asked. But when I tried to explain, I couldn't find the words. How could I tell her that there was something in the water, something I couldn't even describe? We swam back to shore, and I spent the rest of the day feeling restless, my skin prickling every time I glanced out at the ocean. That night, Emily fell asleep early, exhausted from the snorkeling. But I lay awake, watching the waves through the sliding glass doors. I kept thinking about the shadow and that floating head we'd seen. Around 2 a.m., I got up to grab a glass of water, hoping it would calm me down. As I was pouring it, I looked out at the beach and froze. There, standing at the edge of the water, was a figure, a person, maybe a man, just standing there, staring out at the sea. He was completely still, his back to me, as if he was waiting for something. I wanted to wake Emily, but I didn't want to scare her. So I just stood there, watching him. And then, without turning around, the man walked forward into the water. Slowly, step by step, he disappeared beneath the waves. I waited, but he didn't come back up. The surface of the water was calm, undisturbed, as though he'd never been there. The next morning, I convinced Emily to go into town with me for the day. I wanted to get as far away from the water as possible. We spent hours wandering through local shops and exploring nearby trails, and for a while I felt safe again. But when we got back to the resort that evening, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the sand, right where I'd seen the man standing the night before, there were footprints. Bare, wet footprints leading down to the water, and then back up again, stopping directly in front of our villa. I didn't say a word to Emily, but I know she saw them too. That night, neither of us slept. Every so often, I'd hear Emily whisper, "Did you hear that?" And I'd shake my head, too scared to admit that I'd heard it too. We were supposed to stay another 2 days, but we packed up and left early the next morning, not even bothering to check out. On the ferry back, I finally told Emily everything. The head in the water, the shadow while we snorkeled, the man I'd seen walking into the ocean. She looked at me in horror and said, "Last night, I thought I heard someone outside just standing there breathing." To this day, I can't explain what we experienced. We've talked about going back to that island just to prove it was all in our heads, but I don't think we ever will. Hunting had always been more than a hobby for me. It was tradition, a rite of passage passed down from my grandfather to my father, and now to me. Every autumn, I took a week off work, grabbed my rifle, and headed into the deep woods of Montana. There was something primal and grounding about being out there. Just you, the wilderness, and the hunt. This year, I decided to explore a new area, far from the usual trails. A buddy of mine had mentioned a place called Red Creek Woods. He claimed it was untouched, crawling with game, but warned me it was remote and easy to get lost. That didn't bother me. I loved a challenge. I arrived at the edge of the forest early, just as the sun began to rise. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves which I loved. My gear felt solid on my back, and my rifle rested comfortably in my hands. I hiked for hours, deeper and deeper, until I found myself in a part of the woods where the trees grew so thick their branches intertwined. That's when I saw some weird tracks. At first glance, they looked like regular deer tracks. I knelt to examine them more closely. Something was off. The shape was right, but the indentations were unusually deep, like the animal that made them was impossibly heavy. The tracks were dotted with dark smears of blood, leading into the denser part of the woods. I stood up, gripping my rifle tighter. Injured deer meant an easy kill, but the sight of those bloody tracks filled me with unease. Still, curiosity won out, and I began to follow them. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest felt. The air felt heavier, colder, and the usual forest sounds had completely vanished. All that remained was a scary silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional drip of what I hoped was dew falling from the branches above. Usually when the forest goes silent, it means there is a predator nearby, but this part of the forest wasn't supposed to have any predators, so I continued. After half an hour of tracking the deer, I came to a small clearing. In the center stood a deer. It was tall, too tall. It stood perfectly still in the middle of the clearing. Its antlers were massive in their size, and its body was huge but also skinny, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. But what froze me in place wasn't its appearance. It was the way it was standing. The deer was upright, balanced on its hind legs like a person. Its forelegs dangled awkwardly in front of it. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared at me. I should have turned around and left right then, but something about the creature held me in place. I raised my rifle, aiming at the strange, unnatural animal. My finger hovered over the trigger, and then it spoke in the most haunting voice I have ever heard. Leave. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard either. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. The deer, or whatever it was, tilted its head, its black, glassy eyes locked onto mine. Leave. It said again in that haunting voice. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care about the gear I left behind. I just needed to get as far away from that thing as possible. In the distance, I could hear something running towards me. Whatever it was sounded like a large creature. I panicked. I full well knew that it was the deer that was sprinting towards me. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. There was the deer running after me. Its head twitched and tilted as it ran, as if it was studying me, enjoying the chase. My boot caught on a root, and I went down hard. The wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to get up. The footsteps were closer now. I turned onto my back, raising my rifle just as the creature stepped into view. It loomed over me. Up close, I could see its skin wasn't right. It was stretched too tightly over its bones, and the patches of fur it had were matted and stained. Its face was wrong, didn't look like any deer I'd ever seen before. The snout was too short, the teeth too sharp. It leaned down, its rancid breath washing over me. "You don't belong here," it growled. I fired. The shot echoed through the forest, and the creature let out an ear-splitting screech. It stumbled back, clawing at its side, but it didn't fall. Instead, it straightened, its black eyes now filled with rage. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The footsteps followed for a while, but eventually they faded, replaced once again by that oppressive silence. I didn't stop running until I was out of the woods and into the clearing where my truck was parked. I jumped in, started the engine, and tore out of there without looking back. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon, and I'd already scrolled through every social media feed twice. My homework sat untouched on the desk, mocking me, but being a typical teenager, I wasn't in the mood for it. Instead, I opened Snapchat. As I swiped through my stories, I noticed a little red number in the corner of the screen. 56 pending friend requests. I usually ignored them. Most were random people I didn't recognize, probably bots or friends of friends I'd never actually met. But that day, curiosity got the better of me. Why not? I muttered to myself and began scrolling through the requests. Some usernames were familiar, classmates I vaguely remembered from middle school or people I'd met at parties. Others were completely random. One username caught my eye, Countdown 13. It was simple, yet oddly intriguing. I figured it was someone trying to be edgy or mysterious, so I added them along with a few others. I didn't think much of it after that and went back to mindlessly swiping through stories. Later that night, I got my first snap from Countdown 13. It was a blank screen with a single line of text. 10. I furrowed my brow, confused. I replied with a simple, "What?" They opened my message but didn't reply. Shrugging it off, I figured it was someone trying to mess with me and went back to watching YouTube videos. The next day, I got another snap from them. This time, it was a photo of a dark, empty room. In the center of the frame was a glowing red clock showing the time, 9 o'clock. Below it, they'd written, 9. A chill ran down my spine. Was this connected to their first message? I typed back, "What's with the numbers?" Again, no response. The snaps continued over the next few days, each one counting down. The photos were always unsettling. An abandoned parking lot, a dimly lit staircase, a cracked mirror. The messages were always short and cryptic. 8, 7, 6. By this point, I was officially freaked out. I told my friends about it, but they laughed it off, saying it was probably just a troll or someone trying to scare me. Maya, my best friend, even suggested blocking them. "Just delete them," she said. "Why are you letting this get to you?" But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the snaps felt personal, like they were meant specifically for me. The snaps only got worse. When the countdown hit 5, the photo was of a house really close to mine. It was taken at night. The houses around were barely visible under the glow of the streetlights. My stomach twisted. I sent them a message. "Who are you? Why are you sending me this?" They didn't reply, but the next snap came faster than usual. 4. This time it was a photo of my front porch. I started crying. I was getting really afraid. I rushed out to lock all the doors and windows, pacing around the house with my phone in hand. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and I was alone. I wanted to call someone, but what would I say? That some random Snapchat account was sending me creepy pictures? The next snap came an hour later. 3. It was a picture of my living room. My living room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, and the tears came back. I was upstairs, and the living room lights were off, just like in the photo. Whoever this was, they were inside my house. I didn't respond. I grabbed a baseball bat from my closet and locked myself in my bedroom. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I tried calling 911, but the line was busy. Then came the next snap. 2. It was a picture of my bedroom door. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes. I pressed myself against the wall, holding the bat tightly. Whoever was doing this was right outside my door. I waited, holding my breath, expecting the door to open at any second. But instead, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. Then silence. My phone buzzed again. 1. It was a photo of my backyard taken from outside. I didn't understand. How had they gotten outside so fast? That's when I noticed the figure in the photo. It was faint, standing in the shadows near the tree line. A tall, thin silhouette with glowing eyes that stared directly into the camera. I dropped my phone, too terrified to move. The final snap came minutes later. 0. It was a video this time. The camera was moving through the woods, shaky and erratic. The audio crackled with whispers and distorted breathing. The video ended abruptly, cutting to black. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my room, gripping the bat until morning. When my parents came home the next day, I told them everything, but they didn't take me seriously. After this experience, I deleted Snapchat and changed my number. I'd been stuck at work late. The storm outside had only gotten worse as the evening dragged on, and I still had a 2-hour drive back home through winding country roads. By the time I left the office, my shirt was damp just from running to my car, and the windshield wipers barely kept up with the sheets of rain pounding down. The drive was miserable. Pitch black, nothing but the narrow beam of my headlights, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the empty road ahead. I was maybe 45 minutes into the drive when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder, drenched from head to toe, his thumb sticking out. At first, I thought I must be imagining things. Who in their right mind would be out here in this weather? But as I got closer, I realized he was real. He looked rough, with long, matted hair plastered to his face and an old jacket that looked like it had seen better days. He wasn't even holding an umbrella, just standing there in the downpour. Something about him made me uneasy, but I figured he must be desperate. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but guilt tugged at me. It was pouring, and there wasn't another car in sight. I rolled down my window just enough to call out, "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere," he said. "Just need a ride." I hesitated, glancing at the empty road ahead. "Hop in," I said finally, unlocking the passenger door. The man climbed in without a word, dripping water all over the seat. I told myself it was fine, just a good deed, nothing more. For the first 10 minutes, he didn't say anything. He just stared straight ahead. His face was expressionless. I tried to make small talk, asking him where he was coming from, but his answers were vague and curt. "Out west," he said. "Visiting family?" I asked. "No." I figured he wasn't the talkative type, so I gave up after that. focusing on the road. The rain had gotten worse, if that was even possible, and my wipers were practically useless. Every now and then I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting stiffly with his hands resting on his knees. It wasn't until I noticed his hands that the unease in my stomach turned into real fear. His knuckles were scraped raw, and he had what looked like blood on his shirt. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was jumping to conclusions. But then, he broke the silence. "Why'd you stop for me?" he asked, his voice so sudden it made me flinch. I forced a laugh, keeping my eyes on the road. "Seemed like you could use the help. Not many people out here tonight." He didn't respond right away, but I could feel his eyes on me. "That's nice of you," he said finally. "Most people don't stop. They just keep driving." There was something in his tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He leaned back in his seat, his head tilted slightly as if he were sizing me up. "You ever think about how dangerous that is?" he asked. I was confused and simply replied, "What?" "Picking up strangers," he said. "You don't know who they are, what they've done." My hands tightened on the wheel. "Well, I like to think most people are decent." He chuckled. "You shouldn't." My pulse was racing now. What did he mean? Why was he saying those things? I glanced at him again, and this time his face wasn't blank. He was smiling. "I need to use the bathroom," he said suddenly. "What?" I asked, caught off guard. "Pull over," he said. "I gotta piss." I didn't want to stop. Everything in me screamed to keep driving, but I didn't want to provoke him either. I nodded and slowed down, pulling off onto the shoulder. "Thanks," he said, opening the door and stepping out into the rain. He didn't go far, just a few feet from the car. He stood there for a moment, his back to me, and I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe I was overthinking this. Maybe he really was just some poor guy down on his luck. Then, he turned around. He wasn't relieving himself. He was just standing there, staring at me through the rain. His smile was gone now. Instead, he looked me dead in the eye, and then I spotted a knife in his hand. I panicked. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun in the mud before catching, and I lurched forward. But I didn't get far. A loud thud shook the car as he slammed into the passenger side, yanking the door open. "Where are you going?" he shouted. I swerved, trying to shake him off, but he grabbed the steering wheel, jerking it hard to the right. The car skidded off the road, crashing into ditch. My head smacked against the window, and for a moment, everything blurred. When I came to, the car was dead, the rain pounding against the roof, and he was gone. I didn't wait to see where he'd gone. I scrambled out of the car, slipping in the mud as I started running toward the trees. The woods were dark and the rain was turning the ground into a slippery mess. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me, but I kept going. I could now hear him behind me, the sound of his boots squelching in the mud. "Come on," he called out. I tripped over a root, falling hard onto my hands and knees. My palms stung, but I forced myself to get up, slipping and sliding as I pushed forward. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, closer. Every time I thought I'd lost him, I'd hear his voice, taunting me. "I'll find you," he said, laughing. "You know I will." I don't know how long I ran. Time felt warped, like an endless loop of terror and exhaustion. But eventually I saw the faint outline of the road through the trees, and beyond that, my car. I burst out of the woods. I made my way back to the ditch. The car was still there, tilted at an awkward angle, but it didn't matter. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands fumbled with the keys. "Come on," I whispered, turning the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Just as I reached for the gear shift, something slammed against the window. I screamed as his face appeared inches from mine. He pounded on the glass with both fists, shouting, "You're not getting away!" I didn't think. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning before the car lurched forward. The mud sprayed as I pulled back onto the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road watching as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles down the road. Even then, I locked the doors and sat there shaking. I called the police, and they said they'd send out a patrol to look for him, but they never found him.